Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 6th Asia Global Institute Public Policy Webinar. I'm Hei Tang, Associate Director of the Institute. The AGI Public Policy Webinar invites leading scholars from universities and think tanks around the world to present current research on global public policy issues and discuss their implications for Asia and the world. The speaker of our webinar today is Dr. Deborah Elms, founder and executive director of the Asian Trade Center, a center that works with governments and companies to design trade policies for the region. Dr. Elms is concurrently president of the Asia Business Trade Association. She also served on the Trade and Investment Council of the World Economic Forum from 2017 to 2019, on the International Technical Advisory Committee of the Global Trade Professionals Alliance, and was chair of the working group on trade policy and law. She was also a senior fellow in the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry's Trade Academy. Previously, Dr. Elms was head of the Temasek Foundation Center for Trade and Negotiations and senior fellow of International Political Economy at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies and Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. She received a PhD in political science from the University of Washington and publishes the Talking Trade blog. On November 15th last year, 15 Asia-Pacific nations, including the 10 member countries of ASEAN, Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, or so-called RCEP. Once ratified by its member nations, it will be the largest trade bloc created in history, accounting for about 1/3 of world's GDP and population, respectively. RCEP has been touted as a global trade game changer because of its sheer size and the inclusion of China. But how does RCEP compare with the 11-nation Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or so-called CPTPP, that came into force at the end of 2018? And what would be the dynamics between the two trade blocs, neither of which include the United States? Will RCEP address the need to bring coherence and rule-based order to the regional trade in goods and services in the digital age? In the first half of today's webinar, Dr. Deborah Elms will walk us through her analysis about the implications of the RCEP for the future of global trade and regional economic integration. Her presentation will be followed by a Q&A session moderated by me. Throughout the webinar, please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box, and I will try my very best to direct your questions to Dr. Elms in the second half of today's webinar. Dr. Elms, please take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Let me open up my screen quickly and begin sharing this with you. So again, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to be here with everyone this morning to talk about RCEP and what the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership means for global trade and then trade here in Asia. And I'm more than happy to discuss the comparison between RCEP and CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, in the Q&A. Because we've been working on both of those issues. I've been working on both of those issues for a very, very distressingly long time, frankly, and I'm happy to talk about either one of them. But let me first go through some slides on RCEP, because I find that many audiences are less familiar with this agreement, despite the headline figures that you just heard about the size and the general importance of the deal itself. So what is contained inside of RCEP? There are 15 countries here that negotiated, well, actually 16 countries negotiated RCEP. So it was all 10 members of ASEAN, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. And for all of the negotiations, India was a member and then dropped out at the last minute. So now we're down to 15 countries here in the region, 15 very important countries and 15 very diverse countries. The agreement was signed in a virtual ceremony at the end of last year and is moving towards entry into force now. It will enter into force when 6 of the ASEAN 10 are ready to allow it to come into force, and when 3 out of the 5, what we call dialogue partners, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, have completed their domestic procedures. The timeline for this is a bit fluid, but the goal is to have it enter into force as close to January 1st as possible. So we are now 6 months away from the start of RCEP. 4 of them have already said that they're finished. China, Japan, Singapore, and Thailand have all completed the domestic level ratification. The Japanese one, I think, is particularly striking because the dialogue partners, the 5 dialogue partners, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, tend to have more complicated ratification procedures than most of ASEAN. And so the difficulty in starting on time was making sure that the dialogue partners were ready, at least 3 of them, because their domestic internal procedures can be long and complicated. So the fact that 2 are already in is, I think, fantastic. We just need to pick up 1 more and then the agreement can start. I think you should note, though, that all 15 are unlikely to be there on day 1. In particular, I would say there's no way that I can see that Myanmar will be ready to start this agreement on January 1st, because they have other challenges domestically inside of Myanmar besides getting ready for RCEP. RCEP is built on ASEAN's models. And so, as I say repeatedly, and I'll say it again today, this is not China's baby. This agreement was negotiated and led by ASEAN from the beginning. Of course, China was there, and of course, China matters. And in fact, as the agreement comes into force, I think China's importance for RCEP will grow. But I think it's important to note that China was not in the driving seat for RCEP. It was ASEAN, and that's partly, again, why it took us 8 years to get RCEP finished, because we had 10 different countries trying to drive this particular agreement to conclusion. The final deal looks very much like ASEAN's internal template for doing trade negotiations. So RCEP has ASEAN language, it has ASEAN types of commitments. It's a bit more ambitious than some aspects of ASEAN, but it never aspired to be a truly high quality, high ambition FTA. That was not the goal of this agreement. And the end result is not that either. Doesn't mean it's not useful, doesn't mean it isn't helpful, but there are more gaps in RCEP coverage than there are in agreements where you volunteered to join and you end up with a high quality outcome. 18 months from now, and I think this is important, especially for a Hong Kong audience, 18 months from entry into force, the agreement opens for new members. So it's possible that although Hong Kong is not in at the moment, Hong Kong could potentially be ready to join 18 months later when the agreement opens. It will be led by a new RCEP secretariat. We don't yet have the details on what that looks like. The negotiators were too tired to sort it out, so they threw it to someone else. But we'll have a secretariat that will manage this in relatively short order, hopefully, I would argue, here in Singapore, but probably in Jakarta, to manage this agreement, because it's complicated. And you can look at how complicated it is yourself. The texts and schedules are online. I've got it linked here to the Malaysian one, but you can also use, my favorite sites actually are Australia and New Zealand. So if you just Google RCEP text, Australia, New Zealand, you will see the full text and all the schedules, all the commitments, and you can look for your favorite thing that you care most about. For goods producers, I just want to flag right off the beginning, it is going to be a challenge to use. And the reason for that is twofold. One is that it's built on existing ASEAN +1 agreements. So this is ASEAN plus China, or ASEAN plus Japan, or ASEAN plus Australia, New Zealand. So there were 5 existing agreements. And the whole point of RCEP originally was, wouldn't it be better for supply chains if we, instead of having 5 agreements that hook the region together, we could just sort of bundle them together, we would have an RCEP agreement. That turns out to be hard to do. Not only because ASEAN itself started to have second thoughts about this, because many of the ASEAN members said, well, wait a second, what I'm willing to do for Australia, New Zealand may or may not be what I want to do with Korea, and certainly not what I want to do with China. And all of them together is a bit daunting. These are some very important countries, and very powerful economic competitors. So that's nerve-wracking if you're ASEAN. But it's also hard because it's the first time, RCEP is the first time that we've had an agreement in place between Japan and China, between Japan and South Korea. So that is a whole new dynamic. And then when India was in, we also had all kinds of new challenges coming from non-existent relationships with India that all had to be overcome. The net result of this is it took us forever and it's complicated. There are 37 different tariff schedules embedded in this agreement. Many of them have 20-year time horizons. And that is challenging for firms, especially in some sectors and particularly in those that are viewed as sensitive. So We were discussing as we were waiting for this webinar to get underway, one sector that's always complicated, dairy. The dairy sector is always hard. And if you look at the benefits in RCEP for dairy, not so fabulous, because we had really conflicting challenges around a very sensitive sector. But what is very helpful for firms, and I'll point this out in more detail in a second, is that we have one rule of origin. So once you manufacture something for RCEP, you can ship it without remanufacturing it into all of the countries. And that is a game changer. And that makes a very big difference for goods manufacturers. There's also better trade facilitation, which I'll talk about more in just a second. So let me just give you some quick examples. This here shows you soybeans. Now I know soybeans are not necessarily interesting to a Hong Kong-based audience who does, it's not like you're growing soybeans, but what I want to point out is a couple of things. The first is that we always have variations in trade agreements. So on the left here, we have some key ASEAN, key RCEP countries. What we have here is the base tariff, and you can see that we all start, so the base tariff is what is the current tariff, varies. And this is true with any trade agreement, with any kind of negotiation. We always have a different starting point for every member. And then you have a different ending point in the case of RCEP for members. And crucially here, some of these tariffs drop, and some of these tariffs for soybeans drop relatively quickly, and some of them drop over a very long period of time. So you can see on the right, the fall off in tariffs on soybeans. Now, how do we end up with this? Because it's negotiated. So you negotiate your way to this outcome here. And at the end of it, the Koreans, for example, they have a big U, and the Chinese have a big U here. U means no commitments at all. So China will maintain its 3% soybean tariff, and the Koreans will maintain this horrific 487% tariff on soybeans for some indefinite amount of time. Doesn't mean it's forever, because they could renegotiate this in the future, but for right now, RCEP has no benefits for soybeans into Korea. Now, why am I pointing out soybeans? I'm pointing out soybeans because, first of all, I want you to see the sort of variation in tariffs, but second, I'm pointing it out because I want you to think about rules of origin and why they make a difference. So the rule of origin for soybeans is something down here at the bottom called wholly obtained. Wholly obtained means you have to grow it, harvest it, fish it, chop it down from inside of RCEP. So you can imagine that inside of RCEP, that's a bit of a challenge to grow and move soybeans around, because not everyone produces soybeans, grows soybeans. But look what happens when we do soybean oil. So soybean oil has the same sort of variation in tariffs. The tariffs overall are higher on soybean oil. Like most products, once you add value, the tariffs often go up. We call that tariff escalation, and you see it here in soybean oil. So the beans themselves had very modest tariffs in place. If you saw the last chart, they were 0, 3%. Soybean oil, 1%, but up to 9%. So we have real variations and higher levels overall, but also some benefits coming on soybean oil. But the key, and I think this is key for soybean oil, is this rule of origin down here at the bottom. There are two ways for you to qualify for RCEP soybean oil preferential tariffs. So in other words, the lower tariffs that you get come about from two different ways of creating soybean oil. The first is a change in chapter classification, and the second is a regional value content of 40%. I'll explain this just briefly, and then I'll come back to it in a minute. Change in chapter classification is it was a soybean, and in this case, when you squish it and you make a bean oil, it's a different chapter. It goes from the raw bean to the different chapter oil. Not every product does this. Let me be clear. Not every product does this, but soybeans do. So you can import the beans from anywhere. You can bring in Brazilian soybeans. And as long as you squish them in RCEP, you can then qualify under change in chapter classification for all of these lower benefits across all 15 members in RCEP. If you can't squish them for whatever reason, you can also import. RVC 40 says 40% of the value has to come from inside of RCEP. So when you squish the bean and you do whatever else you do to the bean, as long as 40% of the value is RCEP, you can still add 60% of the value from outside of RCEP. So there are different ways to qualify for soybean oil that suddenly makes this competitive even for countries that don't produce soybeans. And this kind of rule of origin and qualification mechanism is true for an awful lot of products, including agricultural products. So you wouldn't think you're competitive in certain sectors, but actually the rules are very flexible in this sense to allow more and more companies to compete in the RCEP space in different kinds of goods, and then, as you'll see later, services and investment. So let me give you a second sort of example, just to give you some flavor of what is in RCEP. So this is on, I'm going to do a couple here on swimsuits. Existing tariffs on swimsuits can be very, very high. In general, we find tariffs on swimsuits 9, 10, 12%. You can see here that China's swimsuit tariff was 10%. There was no agreement in place for Japan, but now Japan has access to the Chinese market, and you can see that this 10%, almost 11% tariff on swimsuits is dropping to 0. Now, over a long, admittedly long period of time, so it's not going to benefit the swimsuit producer today, but over time it will make a difference. And those tariff time horizons could potentially get crunched later as they renegotiate this agreement. It's better though for ASEAN. So there are very high tariffs on swimsuits across ASEAN. You can see that right here on the left of this. The base rate is up to 30% tariffs on swimsuits. And then RCEP drops most of them to 0 immediately, and the rest come down over time. So you can see that there are lots of benefits coming in RCEP for something like swimsuits. It's true for most apparel items and most footwear items as well. The tariff schedule looks like this. So this is China's tariffs for ASEAN. I apologize, it's a little blurry, but it is what it is. I didn't want to retype it. So this is swimsuits here, boys and girls swimsuits. They had very high tariffs. They dropped to 0 immediately. So that I think is very useful. And you'll see this in a lot of different product categories across RCEP. For Indonesia, same thing. So Indonesia said for China, now Indonesia has a schedule that's for China, for Japan, for Korea. So this is where we get so many tariff schedules. Indonesia said, I don't want to give all of you the same benefits. I'm going to give them country by country. And then ASEAN gets a separate one. So Indonesia's tariffs for China were also at 15%, also dropping to 0 on entry into force. So the point is, there's a lot of potential opportunities in here, and you'll have to look very carefully at these tariff schedules to see what happens to your particular product of interest. All of them require rules of origin, which is we want to make sure that American or European or Brazilian products do not sort of sneak in somehow and get access to RCEP benefits, including, I would say, Hong Kong content as well. We don't want to just stick a new label on the box that says made in. We need to make sure that the product is actually made to fit the rules in RCEP. So I'm going to go through this one pretty quickly and just say that there are 2 main ways that we have rules of origin in a trade agreement. So a trade agreement rules of origin are, how do I know that this product, this coffee cup, is made in RCEP and can then be distributed across RCEP? Well, one way is wholly obtained, 100% grown, harvested, etc. The second is I have to transform it. So it was, I don't even know what is in this coffee cup, but some sort of, bamboo fiber, I think is one of these bamboo things. Bamboo fibers and some kind of plastics, and I have no idea what else. But whatever it was those things. It got transformed into a coffee cup here in RCEP. As long as it substantially transforms and meets the rules that are listed for coffee cups, this product can be called an RCEP coffee cup. So there are 3 main ways that we do this. Change in chapter, tariff classification or heading. Many of this will be familiar to those of you who do trade in goods anyways, but I just want to note that that's in there. There are some process rules for chemicals. So if you're a chemical producer, this is very helpful. And then value added. And usually in RCEP, the RVC threshold is low. So it's 40%, which means that for a company that's in Hong Kong, you can still produce goods, you can still distribute goods into RCEP countries for inclusion into RCEP goods at 60% of the value. So there's still hope for non-members. So let me just show you what this does for textile. So I'm back to my swimsuits here. So here's swimsuits. You can see the entire chapter is change in chapter. Okay, so it was fabric, it becomes a swimsuit, it qualifies. That is fantastic. Let me give you the alternative to that. This is just for Vietnam. Vietnam trying to export swimsuits to Japan. You can see that RCEP says change in chapter, was fabric, now it's a swimsuit, get the benefits into Japan. CPTPP rules, unbelievably complicated. This is the make lawyers happy model of trade negotiations for trade in apparel products. You can see how complicated that is. So yes, you can do it, but only if you're using certain kinds of fabric and not other kinds of fabric, and you knit and you cut and you do it to shape in the territories. And I mean, this is mind-boggling. And ASEAN Japan has something very similar. So by comparison, RCEP rules tend to be much simpler. much more flexible, and provide an easier way for firms to qualify for the tariff offer on the tariff preferences on offer. This is very helpful for you. What doesn't count, you have to do more than just minimal processing. So you can't just take two things like two Lego pieces and stick them together and call it good. You can't have two Lego pieces and you pull them apart and you call it good. You have to actually substantially transform something, like in any FTA. Now, the RCEP will have one preferential certificate of origin. So once we have the certificate of origin filled out and we've trained our staff on how to do that, you can much more easily move things around the region because you're not trying to train people on multiple different preferential certificates of origin. So much easier to use. Plus, there are more rules in here on trade facilitation and customs, which I think will be very helpful, including release times that are specified, so it's faster movement through customs. Extremely helpful. And there's an authorized operator scheme available for those of you who are in RCEP countries. You should be looking into that scheme because it should make it easier for you to move goods in and around the region. Now, not everyone makes goods. So I often hear that RCEP is a goods only agreement, and that is not true. RCEP also includes services commitments. Because ASEAN's existing agreements were really weak for services commitments, RCEP is by default going to be better because they cared more about services. We had more services competitive countries. It was fantastic. But there's a giant catch on services. It is super complicated. It is super complicated. I just did a session on Friday with Cambodian trade officials, and I was trying to get the officials to figure out whether or not you could deliver a service, in this case, landscape architecture in RCEP. And even trade officials struggled to figure out whether or not it was possible because it's complicated. And I'm not going to go into the details right now, except to say the scheduling for services in RCEP is super tough. It's not impossible to unravel. It's just, it's two different approaches and complicated. But what there is in the chapter as well, which I think is fantastic, especially for those of you who've been trying to deliver services in Asia, you'll know that licensing and qualification is one of the biggest obstacles to you delivering services because you have to take the bar exam in Thailand or whatever. So now there are supposed to be fewer of those. And I think this is also key, limits on what we call performance requirements for services. So you're no longer limited to just X number of branches or offices. You're no longer allowed to have rules that require local staff hiring or equity requirements or so forth. So there's a whole bunch of stuff in the chapter itself, which I think is very useful. On investment, everybody wanted investment. So the rules on investment, I think, are very helpful, and the scheduling is very helpful. In other words, we want your investment. So please come. Lots of new rules that prohibit what I would call investment performance requirements, things that make often an obstacle for you investing. Very helpful. The one caveat I will make on investment is that there's no investor protection mechanism in place right now. So we typically in an FTA, we have something called Investor State Dispute Settlement, ISDS. And in RCEP, there isn't one. So there's a commitment now to negotiate some kind of protection mechanism to ensure that if you invest in an RCEP country, the government itself will not come in and unfairly expropriate or seize your assets and fail to compensate you properly. So there's not, that mechanism is not there at the moment, but is meant to be coming. The bottom line is that RCEP is going to trade, I think, is going to transform trade in the region. So it will now be in Asia for Asia. Now you say, well, we've had a lot of trade in Asia. Yes, we've had a lot of trade in Asia, but mostly what we've had is raw materials, parts, and components that get assembled and then shipped out. We have not as much as you might imagine trade of finished goods, final goods, crucially no trade in services or limited trade in services. Because it's been so complicated. But as we phase in RCEP, it should be the case that we have more trade in manufactured goods, more trade in agricultural products, and more trade in services than we've had in the past. And I think that's going to be very useful. Also critical is that firms themselves will start to think Asian. So they will say whether or not the agreement has a benefit for me is sort of less relevant. It's that I'm thinking about Asia as a final market itself. So even if I'm not covered, and this is where actually Hong Kong could benefit, because not everyone will even realize that Hong Kong is not part of RCEP at the moment. They might think of Hong Kong as Asia, make in Asia. That mindset actually does matter. And it will probably be, the agreement itself will be upgraded over time. They will meet regularly, it will follow ASEAN's model. It will meet regularly. They will have senior officials meetings, they will have ministers meetings, and they will have leaders meetings. And when you have that schedule in place, you automatically have to have something that that minister can announce, which means you have to have some kind of commitment, some kind of upgrade, some kind of schedule change, some kind of something, so that they can have a nice announcement at the end of each meeting, at the end of each leader summit. So I think there will be changes coming in RCEP. So you should view this as the sort of base for RCEP that will get better over time. And the last thing I just want to mention before I close is just the strategic importance. So pulling out from the details themselves to say, what does RCEP actually do? How is it a game changer? It's not just the content of the agreement itself. It's also that we have 15 countries in Asia who agreed to conclude something, which is a miracle. Frankly, it took a lot of work, a lot of effort. And now once they start making it, that institutional platform, all of those meetings, that secretariat keeping an eye on it, creates momentum for Asia and RCEP to actually start delivering new things on trade, new rules that make sense to the region, new standards. I don't think they're going to go back and look at old standards, but new standards on things like artificial intelligence or electric vehicles or whatever is the new thing of the future. You could imagine, I could imagine, that there will be an Asia version of this anchored on RCEP. And so I think that it wasn't part of the agenda when they started this. They didn't think, oh, let's transform trade. They thought, let's make it easier to do trade. And now that we're in post-COVID, it becomes even more important to think about how do we make better trade conditions in general. And I think RCEP sets us up quite nicely actually to do that. So is RCEP a game changer? Yes, I think RCEP is a game changer. RCEP has the potential now at entry into force and beyond to become the platform for trade in the region. And that is something we haven't had before. And given the importance of Asian economies to the global trading system, I think it matters a lot. So let me stop there and take questions from you. I see them already coming in, which is fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Elms. This is fascinating. I learned so much in just 20 minutes. There are already some questions in the Q&A box, but I would like to ask the first couple of questions. The first one is about the global pandemic and the uncertainty that we're all facing. And you mentioned Myanmar may not be going to rectify in January next year because of this domestic political issue. And we also know that there have been escalating trade tension between China and Australia, and there have been ongoing tension in the region. What kind of uncertainties should we be prepared for about RCEP? Will there be countries dropping out from RCEP in the end, or there will be quite a lot of renegotiation about the terms, about the schedule of tariff reduction and whatnot?
I don't think you'll see a renegotiation. So the agreement that you have is the agreement, and it will not change. I mean, it will get better, but it's not going to. You're not going to suddenly say, "I can't sign on to that." What you might find, and again, you have to think about how ASEAN operates. So ASEAN will sign an agreement, and then it will take a certain period of time before all 10 actually are signed on to that. And it could, in the ASEAN context, it can take a decade. I'm hoping it's much shorter than that here. But there will be members who are not going to be ready on January 1st. Because frankly, for some members, especially for our least developed colleagues in ASEAN, there are some ambitious and challenging issues to be addressed through this agreement. It takes a certain amount of time to make sure, are my rules, my laws, the elements part of RCEP, do they match to my existing rules? And if not, can I change them? That takes some time. So I think you're going to see not 15, could be 14, could be 10, could be 9, but whatever. It will start with however many, and then it will start adding the members as they ratify over time. I don't think it's forever. Again, I don't know what's going to happen in Myanmar, but with the possible exception of Myanmar, I think the rest will come on board because they said they will see that if you're in, you have better benefits than if you're not in. And in a post-COVID world, we are all looking for sources of economic growth. RCEP delivers lower risks, greater certainty, and any firm coming out of COVID is like, please give me, above all else, less risk and greater certainty. And I think that will push governments, even recalcitrant governments that are a little nervous about this, to do RCEP. And in fact, you mentioned tensions along the way. We've had a lot of tensions across the negotiating process. We had times when governments could not speak to one another in the same room anywhere, like they just couldn't even be in the same room. But in RCEP, they sat side by side. So I think these are sort of pragmatic governments who can say, okay, we have tensions security, we have tensions political, but for economic reasons, we're going to be able to stay consistent on economic messaging. And they seem to have been able to deliver it so far. Will they always be able to do so? I don't know, maybe we need to be a fortune teller, but I would say up until now, they have largely managed to do so. And that suggests to me that they should continue to be able to do so.
Great. Let me ask a more academic or broad question, and that is about trade diversion, and you touch on that briefly. We know India last minute decided not to be part of the RCEP, and there got to be quite a lot of reorganization of the global supply chains in the region. Do you see other countries, possibly India, later on realize the damage of the trade diversion and therefore decided to join RCEP later on? And what would be the negative impact on the non-member countries arising from the trade diversion?
I think it's a great question. Trade diversion is one of the reasons why economists dislike regional or bilateral trade deals, because they say it distorts incentives. You end up, instead of global trade, you end up with regional trade, or bilateral trade gets distorted. It's a problem, which is true. Very true. And there will be, I think, post RCEP, both trade and investment diversion. Because if you look around the globe, you say, wow, I could go anywhere with this operation, whatever it is. I'm going to make coffee cups. I could make them anywhere. If I'm going to make them anywhere, why not make them in an RCEP economy so that I can sell them in an RCEP economy at reduced tariffs with better trade facilitation, one rule of origin, better services coverage, investment procedures that are supposed to be streamlined. Why would I be outside of RCEP? So yes, I think you will see trade and investment diversion as a result, especially of these large mega regionals, because the benefits of being in is significant. It's 15 large economies, as you mentioned, a third of global trade. In is better than not in. So yes, you're going to see trade and investment diversion.
Good. And my follow-up question on this is, I remember the famous professor in economics, Professor Bhagwati, has said that FTAs will make the world look like a big spaghetti bowl. Do you see signing of the RCEP and other regional trade agreements like CPTPP as substitutes or complements for the possibility of multilateral liberalization that has been long overdue due to the inefficient WTO, I would say?
Yes. So, I mean, my preference would be always to have global trade rules. Global trade rules, so much easier to use, crucially for me, much easier for small firms to use, because small firms then don't have to figure out what does RCEP say, what does CPTPP say, what does ASEAN say, what's this bilateral say, like that is just too complicated. So best for sure, global trade rules. But we have a global institution, and I was reflecting on this last week. We have a global institution that has not delivered serious results in much of anything since some of my staff members were born. So some of my staff members have never seen the WTO deliver anything except an agreement on trade facilitation. Like that is a crazy long time with no forward progress on the global trade rules, global trade regime. That's a challenge. So in that vacuum caused by the inability of the members to get their act together and cooperate, you create space for these agreements. I think regional agreements are better than bilateral for a million different reasons. And I think that is where we're going to get to. We're going to have this fragmentation of the system. At some point, the fragmentation will become a real problem. And then we hopefully will go back together again and create global rules that make it better. But it's going to be a long time, I think, between now when we're moving towards regional deals and when the global system itself is creating sort of sub-agreements among cooperating members. We're going to have sort of coalitions of the willing and regional deals creating real problems. It's going to be a problem, especially going to be a problem for small businesses. So I apologize on behalf of small businesses for this mess that we've created. I don't think it's going to get sorted out for a long time. I really don't. So that means follow the regional agreements. Because by default, if you're a business, you don't have time to wait for the global trade regime to get its act together. You're just going to have to take whatever benefits are on offer. I would say RCEP, CPTPP, fantastic.
Great. There are already 17 questions in the Q&A room, and many of them are about the CPTPP. And in general, they're interested in knowing your analysis about the two trade blocks. You know, what are the differences and how the common member countries between the two will potentially facilitate the integration of the two.
There's some great questions. So I have said it to audiences on CPTPP for years now. Come to me and I will find you money in CPTPP. I will find you more market access. I will lower your costs. That's the kind of agreement that CPTPP is. And so far, I haven't had any firm that's come to me and said, there's no benefits for me in CPTPP. Okay, so CPTPP delivers benefits, whether you make food, you make clothing, you make high-tech products, you're in services, you do digital, whatever it is, benefits coming on CPTPP. It's not a perfect agreement, but it's very, very good. RCEP is, it was not aspiring to be CPTPP. It's way more diverse. The members in RCEP, I keep saying, which I think is true, they were drafted. How did you get in RCEP? You didn't volunteer to be in RCEP. You didn't say, gosh, what I really want is a trade deal that covers all of Asia. No, you're in RCEP because you were a member of ASEAN or because you had an agreement with ASEAN. And so now, all of a sudden, I'm in an Asian trade deal. There are benefits to that, but there's also some skepticism. Like, I'm not there because I wanted to be there. And so you saw that tension. And the net result for RCEP is some great benefits, some mediocre benefits, and some areas with no benefits at all. So like the consistency is a bit different. So I always say, so CPTPP is here, RCEP is sort of here, and then ASEAN at the moment is weirdly sort of below, but also a little bit above. Like the ASEAN comparison is the challenging one. It's RCEP is higher quality on many areas than ASEAN, which is a shame because now ASEAN should, at the minimum, lock in its RCEP commitments to each other, and then I think go beyond that. But that is very hard for ASEAN to grasp. So, you know, that's where we're at. But it's not CPTPP. And the reason for that, again, is CPTPP, I wanted to be there. I wanted to engage in tough, high quality, high standard outcomes. So what's the difference? You saw on RCEP how we had tariffs that said you, unbound. I don't make any changes. That is not possible in CPTPP. You had to open up every single tariff line. And most of them, except for a few handfuls of things, to zero. And most of them to zero on day one, not even across 20 years, day one. So we're literally now in year 4 of the tariff schedules for CPTPP, and almost all trade in goods is already tariff free. So that's the difference. RCEP is going to be 20 years, and even then there's going to be that annoying Korean tariff on swimsuits. CPTPP, 0. And 0 is so much easier for firms to use, including small ones. Small, even though you say, so CPTPP is so complicated. Yes, 0 is not complicated. So as long as I meet the rules of origin, I get 0 tariffs into all CPTPP members. That is really easy for firms to deal with, as opposed to 37 different tariff schedules in RCEP, some of which drop to 0, some of which don't. Again, there's benefits to be had, but it's just much more complicated to work it out. And so that's some of the differences between these two deals.
Great. There's a specific question about non-tariff measures. What do you see as the tendency within the RCEP for the further reduction in non-tariff barriers among the member countries?
Well, this is a great question, isn't it? So we're working on this project now with ASEAN on non-tariff measures. Again, we've done several projects on non-tariff measures in ASEAN, and it is a challenge. So ASEAN has had, if you go through and you look at all the ASEAN commitments, about 1 million times they've said, we will not continue to impede trade using things other than tariffs. And what have they done? They have continued to impede trade using all sorts of measures other than tariffs, like quarantine on agricultural products, standards rules, labeling rules, customs slowdowns, licensing, permits, all kinds of things. Despite lots of commitments not to do that, they do it anyways. Why do they do that? Because it's, you know, I mean, the competition is tough. So, you know, you don't really want all that competition. You create non-tariff measures to keep out foreign goods. Sometimes you create them. Let me just be clear. It's okay to have measures, especially for human and animal, plant life and health, et cetera. But we see a lot of them crossing over to be straight up barriers to trade. RCEP, unfortunately, in this case, is built on Asean's model. And Asean's model is, we're going to talk about it, but we're going to do very little. So the net result in RCEP at the moment, especially in things like the sanitary and phytosanitary for food, and what the rest of the world calls TBT, technical barriers to trade, and ASEAN calls straight cap standards, conformity assessments, and regulatory procedures. Those are really thin in RCEP. So they exist, but they're really thin. And so what I would say to companies, especially who are listening to this, there are opportunities in RCEP coming where you can potentially be involved in creating some kinds of consistency in rules, standards for SPS and TBT issues. So if you're really interested in that, you need to follow along with RCEP, you need to engage with the members, and you need to say, hey, let's open up a discussion about whatever it happens to be, cosmetics, toys, chemicals, fruits, fill in the blank what, and then there's the potential to create consistent rules that limit non-tariff measures going forward in RCEP. But it will require engagement by companies, because left to their own devices, governments are less enthusiastic about this, especially in RCEP.
Great, thank you. There are all new questions coming in just in the last 2 minutes. Question about SMEs. How can we make it easier for SMEs to benefit from RCEP? For example, is there any plan to create a smart information platform where an SME can log in, fill in some data, and get immediate information on the goods and services?
No, there's no such plan. I mean, it would be awesome, right? It would be great. No, so we've been creating a bunch of materials now. We've got 2 booklets coming out with the Ministry of Trade here in Singapore to help Singaporean small businesses navigate. In this case, it will be on services and investment and on intellectual property rights. Those are hard to do, to be honest. Once you try to write materials that are of benefit to small businesses, that's challenging because the language is different and we're having real arguments with officials over whether or not we should use this word or that word, because they like, as you might imagine, trade words, legal words. Businesses don't. So trying to navigate that is challenging. And at the end of the day, it's very hard to create materials that small businesses can use. Every government will tell you they're doing this, they're giving it their all. Some of them are, I think, to be fair. I mean, this is a tough challenge. It's really tough. But there is no easy way necessarily for firms to do this, although there are some governments that do it better. So let me just say, like Singapore Customs, as an example, has their website is better than most. Australia has a fabulous new one where you can put in the thing that you want to sell, so coffee cups. And then it will come up with the RCEP schedules, the RCEP rules of origin that apply to this. So that's better, but it still is not so helpful because most small businesses would have no idea what it means if it says CC, ROOCC. Well, what the heck does that even mean? So this is the challenge with these things, like translate. Not only do you have to get the information into people's hands, but you have to do it in a way that makes sense to people. That's the disconnect, and it's always a problem for small businesses. If you're a larger company, there's software solutions for you. If you're a large company, you can buy software packages where you run your existing inventory and all of your internal documentation through the system, and it will go, boom, did you know that you have such benefits coming ahead, and this is what you need to do, and here's the paperwork, and it spits it out for you, and you go, wow, that's fantastic. But smaller firms, to pay for that software is just too expensive right now. So this is the challenge always for being small. There are just information costs that are high. So we do a lot of work with our small businesses to train them up on the right language. What are they looking for? Where do they find information? We try to translate things into normal language as much as we can. But it's tough. It's really hard to get small businesses to understand what the benefits are and then how they might harness those benefits.
I realize there's a chapter in RCEP on SMEs. I don't know whether this is common among the new FTAs, but at least the signatories were aware of the challenges that you just mentioned. Could you comment on the chapter on SMEs? Yeah. Is it just some philosophy that they want to put out and they want to be nice to SMEs? For me.
Yeah, this is a tough one for me because obviously we work with, thousands of small businesses and I want things to be easy for them. When you stick a chapter in there for SMEs in trade agreements, what happens? As far as I can tell, nothing. What is supposed to happen is that you have a sort of one-stop shop created with information and inquiry points, and it'll be easier for small businesses to use a trade deal. The reality that I have seen is if the government does it at all, they set it up at the beginning and then they abandon the project. And so you end up with links that are broken, information that's out of date. It's not, they just put the text, they take the RCEP text, which is 510 pages of legal text and 14,000 pages of schedules, and they just put it on the SME site and they go, here you go, guys, I've done it for you. And that doesn't work because any business, especially a small business that tries to read the legal language of a trade agreement is they're going to open to page 1. They're going to say, I don't even know what we're talking about on page 1, and just close the thing. And that's the end of that. So again, it's very challenging actually to figure out how do we help small businesses leverage these opportunities. It requires more than just having a website. And that's challenging. There are some governments though in RCEP who are very good at it. I think who are very good at it. The Malaysians tend to be quite good at getting SME materials out. The Philippines, because there are a lot of SMEs, really good. Tons of training, tons of activities, etc. So there are some governments that get it. They understand why it matters. They try very hard, but it is a real challenge to get SME friendly information into the hands of small businesses.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions about the tech sector, and I want to rephrase the question as follows, and that is about e-commerce. There's a chapter on e-commerce. How would RCEP transform the e-commerce industry and potentially change the tech sector, or may potentially benefit the SMEs?
The single most disappointing part of RCEP for me is the e-commerce chapter. So this is the thing that we worked on the hardest, that I went to 17 rounds to try to say, please, 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 please be ambitious in digital. And at the end of it, not ambitious at all. So there are 3 things, there are lots of things you want in the digital space, right? Lots of things that you would like, lots of things that would be useful, including some stuff that got in there on, for example, digital rules in intellectual property. Now, a lot of you are going, this is something I don't care about, but actually you do, because what does that do? It says, if you want to create a PowerPoint presentation and you use someone else's something, what are the rules around that? So IP digital is something that there's some new rules in RCEP, yay. But the big 3 are missing, or they're there, but there's such a horrible footnote attached to them that they're not helpful. So what are the big 3? The first thing that you really want in a trade agreement, I think, is you want no customs duties on digital electronic transmissions. Now that sounds very technical. Let me put it into normal language. It says, if you are going to do education services like this, if you are going to download software, if you are going to get consulting services, you are supposed to pay a customs duty, a tariff. This is different from tax. This is a tariff, as if you were importing a coffee cup from abroad. Customs duties require you to understand customs, to pay tariffs, to fill out the paperwork, to do a customs duty on an electronic transmission. We've had a moratorium in place forever, thank God, which has prevented this from happening, but the moratorium is likely to collapse, and then you might have to pay customs duties, tariffs on digital downloads. Now, it's unworkable, it's gonna be a disaster. But anyway, so RCEP doesn't guarantee that that will stay in place. That says the customs duty, we do whatever the WTO does. If the WTO collapses, then the RCEP also collapses. So this is no good. That's the first one. The second thing that you want is more information about when you can move information cross borders. And I would argue, if nothing else, in COVID, did we not learn the importance of allowing information to flow between markets? You wouldn't have known about caseloads, variants of virus, et cetera, if we didn't have information that could be flowing and analyzed in different places. If we didn't have information that flows, then you wouldn't have been able to order from overseas. You wouldn't have been able to pay for things. I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons why cross-border information is important and the lifeblood of the economy. That's in RCEP. It says you can move information cross-border, Then there's a giant exceptions clause, except when the parties decide it's in their national interest not to do so. And then there's an even worse footnote that says, we, the parties, get to decide when it's in our national interest and you don't get to argue about it. So yes, it's there, but really at the end of the day, I get to do whatever I want. So what's the point? So that's the second big one. And then the third one is the same kind of thing, which is where do you have to house that data? And just like cross-border data flows in RCEP, it's there with a massive exceptions clause and then this wretched footnote. I get to decide when it matters to me and when it doesn't. And so the net result of that is the big three are really not in RCEP. Huge missed opportunity. This is a part of the globe that is at the forefront, I would argue, of digital innovation. And when you create these new policy uncertainties, you make it harder for people to innovate and harder for that innovation to travel around Asia, where I would argue, especially as we all sit here on our laptops or computers, it is benefiting all of us, especially in COVID, to be able to be online and deliver services and goods and order things without having to travel. So if we've, again, the timing of this is just so astonishing to me. At the moment when we are all online is the moment when RCEP said, never mind, we're not really going to lock in online benefits. So huge missed opportunity.
I see. So, if I understand you correctly, you mean there's so many exceptions and the rules on tech and e-commerce are so loose that at the end, it probably doesn't have much effect on the much needed digital transformation. Mm-hmm.
No, no, it's, again, missed opportunity for me. Doesn't mean it's forever, thank goodness, because we can upgrade it over time. We can get together. Again, please, companies, push hard on governments to do so. So you could have more rules over time, but the initial rules are so, I don't even think you can call them weak. To be not, again, in the main areas, like this is a hard foundation to build on because you have built such weak foundations, like, oh yeah, huge missed opportunity. And it's very personally irritating, as you can tell.
Great. Let me ask two more questions and then we will conclude. So my colleague Al Rees asked, do you foresee RCEP eventually taking on issues that are included in CPTPP? For example, labor standards, culture, environment, government procurement.
So government procurement is in RCEP, but right now it's a cooperation commitment because the members were not interested in committing at the moment on procurement, but they understood that there should be more conversations about it. So there is a chapter in RCEP on procurement. Again, very weak right now, but at least it's there. Labor and environment, not in RCEP. And they're not in RCEP because at the time, members were not interested in negotiating on labor. In this case, is not movement of labor. It's about labor protections, human rights, worker rights, et cetera, however you phrase it. Not there. And environment, not there. This is not a region that wanted to torpedo the entire agreement over differing ideas on labor and environment and decided we'd put them to the side, may or may not come back to them in the future. I find it hard to imagine they would do so in an RCEP context. So not there. Doesn't mean, again, they could potentially come back at some point, but not there right now. Interestingly, though, in RCEP, and I get this question a lot, these are also countries, many of them, who have negotiated and signed on to and upheld high standards, actually, in labor, in environment, in human rights, et cetera. Because anyone who negotiates, CPTPP had to do so. Anyone who negotiates with the Europeans had to do so. So there are governments in RCEP who have signed on to such commitments outside of the region, but they were reluctant in this case to do it within RCEP context. And I think it was just a pragmatic decision to put that to the side because it was going to be hard enough to get 15, at the time 16, countries to come together and actually commit to relatively ambitious agreement that would cover all of this diverse region. And so that was just put to the side.
Great. So there are a few questions about China, and we all understand, why our participants are excited about understanding the impact of RCEP on China. First, how can RCEP potentially reduce or alleviate some of the tension that we have seen between China and select nations within RCEP, for example, Australia and Japan? And second, how can RCEP help China to internationalize its currency and potentially expand its current Belt and Road initiatives?
Okay, this is a bit challenging, and we are almost out of time, so I'll try to be brief. So, you know, RCEP was always declared to be the China-led alternative to the US-led CPTPP. While I think it's true the US did lead TPP at the time, China did not lead RCEP. China's role in RCEP was to be there, to be engaged, to be a neutral broker as much as possible, and to get the deal done. Because they're already, I mean, frankly, China is already the #1 or #2 importer and exporter for every single market in the region. So they're already, in the competitive stakes, they already are winning. So they don't really need an RCEP in order to do better. They're already winning the competitive stakes. What they wanted was a deal to be done, because it's better to have a deal than not have a deal, you know, useful. And so they were just very, I don't think that they weren't obstructionists. They weren't particularly helpful, I would say. They just sort of said, let's do what we can to get an agreement done. Now that it's done, however, and so that also, that pragmatic response requires setting aside some areas of tension outside the room. Okay, that's not an RCEP thing. You're having a fight over rare earths or fill in the blank what. That's somebody else's problem. We're not going to deal with that here. We're just going to get the rules done. Over time, of course, that creates some challenges that may have to be tackled in the negotiations that go on after this. And lots of people have asked, can you constrain China's particular behavior by RCEP? No, no. At the end of the day, any FTA is only as good as the members want it to be. If a member were to get into an agreement, an FTA, and they have no interest in following those rules, then they're not going to follow those rules, especially if they're a big, important player. There's no FTA created that would constrain the behavior of a really big country that says, screw it, I'm not interested, right? It's just not going to happen. Even though, yes, RCEP has legal provisions. Actually, they're good. They don't cover every single area, but they are quite good. And it's legally binding in many areas, and there are recourse that members could take. The reality is, would you do that? Can you imagine a situation under which Cambodia says to China, actually, you know what, you're out of violation of these rules, and so therefore we're going to take you to dispute settlement in RCEP? No. So China has to just abide by the rules. But over time, again, this creates some tensions, because now as we go forward, China's weight in the agreement, of course, matters. And they may, you could imagine, create rules that are beneficial for China, as everybody will do, as the Cambodians will do. The Cambodians will say, hey, let's use the rules to our advantage if we can, on whatever we're creating now. So if we're making new standards on AI or on electric vehicles or fill in the blank what it is, then, you know, big players will have a lot of say and smaller players will have less say. And I mean, it's unfortunate, but I kind of feel like that's how the world works. And we can create an institutional structure that will make it better, that will allow small firms and small countries and middle powers to have a role. But at the end of the day, you know, if you're the world's largest or second largest economy, you get an outsized say in what happens if you choose to take advantage of that. You may not, I don't know, but I'm just saying that, you know, that unfortunately is how the world works.
Great. Can I ask one final question, very brief?
Sure.
Many people said RCEP is a wake-up call for the US government because, you know, they withdrew from TPP several years ago. Do you see the possibility that one day we'll see either China or the US, or unlikely both, that are in CPTPP?
I do. I thought you were going to ask me if I saw the US in RCEP, and that would be a no. And that's a no for so many reasons, but one of them is the US, I can't imagine RCEP clearing US Congress, because it's not the kind of ambition that the US likes to pursue. So US in RCEP, no. US back in CPTPP or something like it, maybe. I think it's much harder than people imagine, but you're right to point out that the competitive challenges for the United States just went up exponentially by being out of this agreement. And weak efforts to say in the US that we're going to do something on digital, which is needed, but that's not the same thing as being part of a regional FTA that covers a third of the globe. You know, you need to be in these trade agreements in a region that cares a lot about trade and economic issues. And if you're not in these arrangements, then you're not in these arrangements. Like you're missing out on the priority area for most of the governments in Asia. And I think that is a problem for the US.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Elms. I learned so much in the last hour. You probably broke our records in terms of having the speaker answering almost all the questions in the Q&A box. You are very efficient, and there's so much detail and wisdom that I probably will watch the replay this afternoon to fully absorb what you just said and what you just told us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Whether the AGI team want to promote either the future event or just the overall social media. So we're going to take a break for 2 weeks. At the end of June, we will have another speaker giving the public policy webinar. But for now, please remember to follow us on various social media platforms. Once again, with the time that Deborah has wisely spent with us, thank you, Dr. Elms. Enjoy your day, and we'll probably will like to invite you again in the near future to talk more about regional trade agreements.
Sure. Thanks so much. I appreciate the opportunity. And thanks everyone for such great questions.
Great. Bye for now. Thank you.